This is part 5 in the Creed 7B Mark I restoration. In the previous video I looked at the selector drum for the print head. This is the actual print head, and as you can see it's very similar to a daisy wheel printer in that there's a disc where there are a series of pins, and each of these pins has one of the printable characters embossed on the end of it. And the printer works by forcing these pins out individually onto the paper, and obviously it impacts the paper through an inked ribbon, and that's what transfers the character to the paper. So really the entire purpose of the machine is to select one of these pins for impacting onto the paper, and as we looked at in the previous video, that is done using the selector drum, which is this, and the print head itself sits on the pins on the end of the selector drum. So the entire purpose of this part of the machine is to select the correct pin, align it in the right position, and then there is a hammer that pushes the pin from the rear and onto the paper, and the paper is fed through the rollers on this side. So just to recap on the way that this drum works, because it is key to understanding the overall operation of the machine. This does not rotate, it's fixed, but it does have a rotating shaft, and the way that the character is selected is the shaft rotates and it is stopped in a particular position depending on which pin is required to print the particular character that's been selected. But the teletype overall is controlled by sending it a series of pulses, 0 or 1 pulses, and all they do is they energize or de-energize a solenoid, and we'll look at the solenoid in a future video. But those pulses have to be turned into a code that can be used to select the character that it wants to print, and that's where this unit comes in. We'll look at exactly how these pins are manipulated in a future video, but the way that the individual character is selected is by putting a combination on these pins. So up is a 1, down is a 0, and the way this is implemented is there is kind of a clutch release on the rear of this. It works a bit like a release bearing on a car, in that when this is pushed in towards the drum, then it forces all these levers out. So when it's pushed in, none of the levers will be engaged. And the reason this is necessary is as these levers are moved, each of these levers is spring loaded and it's constantly trying to push down into the spaces that are encoded into the discs that these levers attach to. So there's a series of 5 discs, actually there's 6 because there is a second character set, but if we ignore the last one for now, there are 5 discs. Each of the discs has slots on its periphery, and the slots on each disc are arranged so that they represent unique codes for each of the possible combinations of these levers. So in other words, when the lever is in a certain combination, then the slots line up for one of these levers. That lever can then drop down into the slots. That then causes this arm to stop in a particular position when it hits that particular lever. That stops the print head in that position, and the character has been selected. So in other words, the position the head stops in is dependent on what the combination is that's set on these pins. But we need the bearing release on the back because the pins are set one at a time, and we don't want a situation where we set the first pin and a lever immediately drops down into a slot, because that blocks out the movement of the other pins. So the way the machine is timed is this is held in position until all the pins are set. It's then released, and then whichever code has been set on the discs allows the relevant lever to drop down and select the character. I'll give a quick demonstration of how this works. I need to use a screwdriver because it is quite a lot of force that's required to make this work. So this is pushed across by the control mechanism, which we'll look at in a future video. We can then set these pins depending on the code that we want to set. So I'll set the first two up. The pin hasn't dropped down yet, but when I release the bearing on the left, the required lever falls down into the space, and in this case it's this one. You can see this particular lever has fallen down, and so when the shaft rotates, it will come up against that particular pin and it will stop, and that has then selected the character that we want to print based on this combination, which is 00011. If we set a different code on these, then a different lever would fall down and this would stop in a different place and select a different character. So the purpose of the rest of the machine is just to enable us to select different combinations on these pins, and as I go through the various parts of the machine, I'll look at how that is actually achieved. The machine can then of course select different characters by simply repeating the process but setting different values on the pins. So if I push this in, you can see they all go down, so their default position is down. They're pushed up in whatever combination they're required. This is released, and then that selects the pin, and that in turn selects the character that we want to print. The print head sits on here, and then this entire mechanism sits inside this part. So we have various functions from this. I need to hang it over the edge because it's got some levers hanging down, so I'll reorientate this and then get back on camera. Okay, so I've arranged them kind of loosely in the positions they would normally sit in when they're installed in the machine. We can see that the daisy wheel print head is free to rotate, and as I say, when it stops in whatever position has been selected, then this arrangement is used to push the pin forward, and this is controlled using a cam on the main control unit, and that in turn presses the pin through a ribbon against the paper and prints the character. So this is obviously quite complicated because there are various levers here that perform other features, other functions. As with anything, it's never quite as straightforward as it first appears. So this is the back of the machine. The carriage sits here, and there are various levers that we'll look at in future videos that perform certain functions to override the operation of this unit and to force certain characters. But as I say, we'll look at that in a future video. That's it for this video. It's just a quick summation of how these two units work together. In the next video we'll look at what I think is the most interesting part of this machine. It's the control unit, and it controls the overall operation of the teleprinter. It's equivalent to the control matrix in a microprocessor, and as I say, it's by far the most interesting part of the machine, and I'll show how that fits into this arrangement and how it controls the teleprinter and decodes the various characters.